Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Standard Chartered webinar on the just transition. My name is Chris Coulter. I'm the CEO of GlobeScan. We're an insights and advisory firm, and I am thrilled to be here with four remarkable panelists, talents, committed climate change thought leaders, and I'll introduce them very briefly, and then I'll come back and set the table a little bit for our conversation. But first, I'd love to introduce Jules Kortenhorst. He's the CEO of the Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI. Good morning to you, Jules. Where are you in the world?
Good morning. I am in Boulder, Colorado, in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains.
Wonderful. What a beautiful part of the world. And it's sunny there, I'm sure, because it's always sunny in Colorado. Yeah,
it is, although it's a bit early for the sun to be up.
Okay, so it's a bit dark. All right, that's fine. And then also, I'd love to introduce Sanna Markkanen. She's the research program lead and senior analyst at the Cambridge Institute for Leadership, Sustainability Leadership, CISL. Hi, Sanna. Good morning.
Good morning, Chris.
And where are you?
I'm in Washington, D.C. at the moment.
Ah, lovely. The sun is up in D.C. now, I expect.
Yes, it is.
Wonderful. And Peter Cashin, he's the Chief Investment Officer and Global Head Climate Finance at the International Finance Corporation, the IFC. Good morning to you, Peter. And I think you're in D.C. as well, yeah?
Good morning, Chris. Yes, in D.C. I think I'd prefer to be in Boulder, but hey, it's not a bad place to be.
Wonderful. And last but not least, Lena Osman. She's the head of sustainable finance at Standard Chartered. And where are you today, Lena?
Hi, Chris. Hi, everyone. Really nice to be here with all of you. I am in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. Really nice and sunny out here.
Beautiful. Fantastic. Dubai. And I'm in Waterloo, Ontario, just an hour west of Toronto, so we have a good international crowd. All right. So today we are going to tackle one of, I think, the most challenging issues in sustainable development and the corporate world, and that's not just climate change, but the just transition. How do we understand and execute on a net zero pathway that's not only what we need to do to get to net zero, but also do it in an inclusive, equitable, and fair way, which is no easy task overall whatsoever. And this webinar, it coincides with Standard Chartered's new just-in-time report that was released today, which is a brilliant piece of research, which shows that we need 95 trillion, with a T, $95 trillion to ensure that the net zero transition happens in emerging markets. So we've got to find that finance and do it in a way that allows for the global south to transition just as the global north must do. So it's a big challenge. I just wanted to share a few findings from some of our research and some research Standard Chartered done, just to kind of set the table, because it is very much part of the global public opinion that's really critical here. And the IPCC report that was released yesterday, the third in a series of this round, showed that we do need to move politics and political issues forward on the climate agenda. So could you pull the slides up, please? And this is from our July 2021 global public opinion research that we're doing at GlobeScan. So there's a 17-country study here that shows that concern for climate change is at the highest level in 23 years of tracking. Just before COP26 in Glasgow, we saw an elevation and a consistent elevation of global engagement and concern on climate change. The next slide shows, I think, more importantly, how people are really responding. And we can see that while personal impacts on climate change are up, they're quite below something like the pandemic, but 36% of people across the world are now saying they've greatly been personally affected by climate change. That's up 5 points in a year, which is important because when it gets personal, we also respond more potently to some of the cues. And the next slide shows the diversity of perspectives and levels of perceived personal impact of climate change. And we can see the spread across these different countries. And countries in the global south, people in the global south are experiencing much more impacts from climate change than some of us in the global north, which is part of why the just transition is so fundamental. And you can see across all of these 24 or 30 countries that we have increasing perceptions that climate change is actually impacting our lives, not now and not in the future, which is an important part of the psychology of getting people to mobilize around climate change. And the last finding is from a LinkedIn poll that Standard Chartered ran last week. We had 1,800 respondents across the world. And the question was around who should pay for the transition of emerging markets to net zero. And the majority of respondents, 53%, said we need a joint effort to try and tackle this, which is exactly why we're here today. So we can drop the slides. And I'd love to hear from each panelist your perspectives from where you sit on where the just transition is and how we might achieve it. And Jules, I'd love to start with you in the Rocky Mountains. So over to you to hear your remarks.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Well, folks, yesterday's report from the IPCC once again underlined the fact that we are facing a planetary emergency. And if you look at the remarks that the Secretary General has made with the release of the various editions, various pieces of this IPCC report, it feels as though he is screaming at the top of his lungs at policymakers around the world about the urgency and the magnitude of the crisis. There is no doubt that if we do not take drastic steps already this decade to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, on a path to eliminating them by the middle of the century, that the future of life on this planet for generations coming after us will be dramatically different than the world that we have experienced. So this is really urgent. And as the research shows over and over and over again, the people who are going to be most impacted, the people who are most vulnerable, the people who, at your slide, Chris, already said, we are feeling the impacts today. Those people are generally the most vulnerable. They're in the global south. They already are at what is called the bottom of the pyramid. And they are experiencing the impacts of climate most immediately. So when you ask me, what is the fundamental aspect of a just transition? It is for policymakers, business leaders, investors and financiers, for everyone to do all we need to do to align with that trajectory that was outlined by the IPCC of 50% reduction over this decisive decade and then net zero by the middle of the century. But that's not all of the just transition. There are other aspects of a just transition as well. Of course, people immediately think about the transition in employment that will need to take place with coal miners, people more broadly in the fossil fuel industry, losing their jobs as a result of this transition. I appreciate and understand the magnitude of that challenge for so many people. I remember when I finished high school, I worked in the Remington typewriter factory in the Netherlands. That factory is long out of business. We didn't have a just transition for typewriter manufacturing, but the crisis that those people faced in their personal life, transitioning away from making a piece of equipment that's no longer useful, is not different from that fossil fuel people face. The good news is green jobs will massively outpace jobs in the fossil fuel industry. In fact, research over and over shows that for every fossil fuel job that disappears, we have somewhere between 2 and 3 new jobs being created in the clean energy economy. But also this transition is so fundamentally crucial that we have to enable people to transition away from working in the fossil fuel arena to working in clean energy. Third aspect that we have to consider is that it is obvious if one is in a wealthy position, one has its own house, it's obvious to think about putting solar panels on your roof. It's now increasingly obvious to think about an electric car. You can start to noodle on what it means to replace the use of gas by heat pumps and induction stove. But not everybody can afford those investment decisions, and not everybody can automatically know how to do this. So how do we support communities in making those transitions, and how do we involve them in the decision making around those transitions? But let me come back to where I started, and that is the most vulnerable people often are in the global south. And that's what the report that Standard Chartered published today is so important. We need to finance a massive investment effort in the global south to make this transition happen. And we'll talk more about it over the course of this panel, but how we structure that financing is going to be crucial. It's clear that that cannot just be savings from the global south, that finance flows will be necessary from the north to the south. But the good news is that many of the investments necessary for a clean energy future are highly profitable, are financially attractive, and we can therefore think about structuring those in a way that combines profit with care of the planet. Chris, thank you.
Thanks so much, Jules. And a quick follow-up question. So you referenced the Secretary General's urgent call for action again, and Cristina Figueres called this report in particular terrifying. And she's generally an optimistic person. We keep doing this. How much longer can we keep urging people to change? And when do we sort of lose the crowd from the level of urgency? And you've been in this space a long time. How do you keep that momentum going?
Yeah, that is a very valid question, because we have been saying this is the last moment. This is the best moment and the last moment that we can take action. I do take hope from the fact that more and more now around the world, people are starting to come to grips with the fact that a clean energy future is actually also a profitable future, is a comfortable future, is a future that works equally well, works better than a fossil fuel future. It is safer, it is less polluting, in addition to the impacts on climate change. But we will have to show results now in the very near future. If we cannot start to prove to the peoples around the world that this implementation is actually doable, and that particularly political leaders are willing to make the tough decisions and lead in an era where leadership is so crucially important, I think we are indeed at risk of losing the interest of people. Well, they've been talking about it forever. I guess there's nothing we can do about it. Despair would not be a good outcome of all of this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jules. Wonderful. Thanks for those great remarks to kick us off. And Sana, I'd love to come to you now. What's your perspective on the just transition?
Well, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with Jules, and his emphasis citing the IPCC report that unmitigated climate change is just not a viable option. If we had unmitigated climate change, a lot of the global land area would become uninhabitable. So we all know that we need to take action, and we need to take action urgently, both to mitigate climate change and also to adapt to climate change that is already happening. So the question that we're faced with really is how this can be done without exacerbating further the inequalities that we already have, both at global and local levels at the moment. And this is especially bearing in mind that those people who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, they are also the same people who have fewest resources to deal with any shocks, and they are also most vulnerable to bad policy. So we really need to create climate policies that support the transition and protect those who are most vulnerable. If we look at the global situation, we're basically faced with two very different types of situations. So on one hand, we have the advanced economies, such as the EU, the UK, and the US, where we need to transition from the prevailing carbon-intensive practices to more sustainable ones. And in these countries, the basic necessities such as food, electricity, transport, and housing are already nearly universally available. And the questions that are relevant for the just transition domestically then center around issues such as the cost and benefits of it at the domestic level. So what sectors of the economy will experience job losses, who will be adversely affected, and how the transition to climate neutrality will impact the cost of living. And in these contexts, just transition is often referred to as a practice of transitioning to more sustainable economies without leaving anybody behind. And this is an amicable, good idea. However, I would like to think that we should go perhaps a little bit further than just avoid existing or exacerbating the existing inequalities, and instead the just transition as an opportunity really for a broader systems change, where climate policies could deliver not just a more sustainable economy, but also a fairer society. And from this perspective, just transition would actually be a process whereby the transition to climate neutrality within societies would result in higher standards of living, better health outcomes, especially for those who are currently most disadvantaged and most vulnerable. It's also important that we consider what the policy tools and levers that are available for us might be to simultaneously mitigate any of the adverse impacts that the transition may have. So Jules mentioned coal miners and so on. So we need to make sure that we don't start addressing existing inequalities, but then simultaneously create new ones. In developing countries and emerging economies, the situation is very different. So they still have very large numbers of people whose basic needs are not yet adequately met. And in these countries, the challenge is not just about transitioning away from the unsustainable practices. It's also about supporting environmentally and socially just development processes. And these would be the sort of development processes that deliver economic growth that is still needed to eradicate the challenges such as poverty and hunger. And at the global level, then, we're faced with the question of climate justice. So we know that those who are most vulnerable to the impact of climate change have benefited the least from the industrial practices that enabled economic growth in the global north, and that are largely responsible for the climate change that we face today. And these people have, as Jules said, fewest resources to deal with any kind of shock. And this is where we come to the questions about moral responsibility. So do the people in the global north have a moral responsibility towards the people in the global south who are suffering from the climate change? And what do people and businesses and financing institutes in the global north need to do to ensure that countries that are still developing will be able to achieve the same level of socioeconomic development that we have in the global north without compromising the global climate targets? And that's a biggie.
It's a very big one, Sana, and I think it speaks to, in the just-in-time report, there's a great statistic that shows 50% of the poorest people in the world only contribute 15% of global emissions. So the inequality and the injustice is there. Obviously, both you and Jules referenced I think, framing action on climate change in a bigger way, the green economy and the green jobs, as Jules said, and you talked about the systemic change and the opportunity to create a more equitable economy. Have we done that well enough? Is that a new idea? Is that something that we should be engaging policymakers more clearly on?
I don't think it's a new idea. I think it's an idea that is evolving. So what we see is definitely more interest and more focus on just transition than we have previously. It's partly related to what has been happening in the world in the past 2 years. So we had the Black Lives Matter movement, we had COVID-19 pandemic that really drew attention to many of the existing inequalities, both at global level but also within advanced economies. And now we are experiencing obviously war in Europe. Wars have been going on in other countries, but for some reason, when there is a war in Europe, it tends to attract a completely different level of attention. So I think these issues about how we can cope with the multiple challenges in increasingly or in unequal societies or societies that we are increasingly aware are highly unequal, and also global levels of inequality. There is more attention to it. Whether being aware of it means that policymakers are actively taking action on it is, I think, another matter.
To be determined and to be found out. Wonderful, thank you, Peter. So in your position in the IFC, you're seeing a global mandate around global governance issues and how finance and the private sector interact in this. What's your take on where we are on the just transition and your perspective?
Great, thanks, Chris. So just to echo a few comments of the other panelists, I mean, the most vulnerable are going to be the most impacted by climate change. At the World Bank Group, our main priority is poverty reduction. So you cannot address that issue without closely taking into account what will be the impact from climate change and ensuring that there is a just transition. So that's really a focus of our work at IFC and the World Bank Group, to ensure that when we are financing the transition, that it's done in a manner that takes into account the impacts more broadly. I'll make a few remarks about what we're doing at IFC World Bank Group in terms of financing the transition. I think several panelists have mentioned the importance of that. This past year, we adopted the Climate Change Action Plan, which is really ambitious. It sets a target of 35% of our investment need to be climate related. And in addition, by 2025, our investments need to be aligned with the Paris Agreement, which is a really such an important undertaking. It's also extremely, it'll be a huge amount of work, but we're up for the task. And the reason that there's so much need for this financing, and it was great that the Standard Chartered report has recently come out to this effect as well. And we have estimated that over the next decade in emerging markets, there'll be an investment opportunity of $23 trillion. And as you said, with a T. So, you know, World Bank Group, IFC, the DFIs, like, we're pretty big, but we're definitely not big enough to finance any number like that. The World Bank has financed over 60 billion in climate finance, and the Financial Institutions Group, where I sit at IFC, we financed over 10 billion over the last decade. And so these are good numbers, but frankly, compared to the numbers in the trillions, it shows the importance of mobilizing and bringing other investors with you. In fact, if we sum up all of the money available from development finance institutions, and we compare that to the amount of funding available from institutional investors, it's 900 to 1. So it's quite a delta, quite a difference. So really, it's important what we do with our $1 in this case. But really what's important is how do we bring some of those $900 into our markets to finance the transition? And the way we do that is really to not only invest ourselves, mobilize from others, but most importantly, create markets, capital markets in particular, that will allow some of this institutional money to come in to finance that transition. And of course, to do it in a just manner. And the way we do that is we work with market regulators. We build the infrastructure to allow for new climate finance products, taxonomies, new types of products such as blue bonds, which we've recently just launched with the ICMA, International Capital Markets Association, and providing also training to prospective issuers on how to issue a green bond or a blue bond and how to deploy those fronts. So I think this is really a critical piece, is how do we bring others with us to do something that we want to do? And, you know, the good news out of the transition and the need to address climate change is it has created enormous business opportunity. And, you know, we're a profitable institution, the IFC, we invest at market rates, and we have to invest more than a third of our investments towards climate. So that demonstrates and shows to the market that this is really a profitable endeavor. I'll pause there because I want to make sure we have time to, to
just
go around.
Thank you, Peter. And the 900 to 1, that's a lot of leverage, and that shows the exponential level of creativity we need on getting the financing. Just briefly, can you describe what a blue bond is for the audience?
Sure. So it's basically under the umbrella of green bonds, and the blue bond use of proceeds goes towards clean water, reducing plastics in oceans, efficient shipping. And it's quite a new product, so it doesn't result in decreased greenhouse gas emissions, but clearly it reduces the impact of the economy on clean water and that resource.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. So Lena, to you. So you're in the bank, you're on the ground making all this stuff happen. What's your perspective on the just transition from your vantage point?
So, Chris, I think a lot has been said by the other panelists, really, in terms of the challenge and in terms of the opportunity. And at Standard Chartered Bank, we have set ourselves a target to achieve net zero from our financed emissions by 2050. While the very nature of our footprint and DNA is in emerging and developing markets across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. With that in mind, these are the markets that will bear the biggest consequences of climate change, as we've just heard. At the same time, these are also the markets that rely on conventional energy sources like fossil fuels to drive their growth and economic prosperity. With growing populations, this makes the challenge to transition even more difficult. Most of these markets will not be able to fund their own transition, and if they do so, their nations will bear the consequences and will be poorer. The further consequence of that, of course, is a lower incentive to deploy local capital towards transitioning, and we fail collectively as humanity to deliver the change that we so desperately need for our own survival. We need the developed world to step in and to step up. Therefore, at Standard Chartered, we believe we have a responsibility to create practical solutions that do not just address climate objectives, but also address a just transition for these markets without depriving them from the opportunities to grow and prosper. As a result, we have put together a plan to identify exactly how we are going to help. First, we have released a transition finance framework to support clients in our markets with aligning their businesses with a 1.5 degrees trajectory. Through this framework, we have outlined certain qualifying activities, and on an annual basis, we will commission external verification of our progress against this framework, and we will update it in line with the latest developments to capture new technologies and evolving taxonomies, amongst other things, to ensure continued alignment as well with science-based targets on the road to net zero by 2050. Second, to address the need to accelerate the transition, we created a dedicated transition acceleration team to support these clients in high-emitting sectors and harder-to-abate sectors with their transition plans and what they can do and what others are doing, and kind of leveraging experiences across our footprint markets, but also through our presence in the developed world as well. Third, we will leverage our experience and our global presence, again, to catalyze finance and partnerships to scale impact, including a plan to mobilize $300 billion in green and transition finance. And fourth, we continue to evolve and adapt our product offering and the development of new sustainable finance products and solutions to cater for the needs of the markets we are in. So this is only a snapshot of some of the many actions we are taking to do our part and ensure that markets and communities we operate in are getting the support that they need, be it in the form of advisory, financing, or thought leadership and innovation. As you've mentioned, we do require a tremendous effort that goes towards innovation and creativity, especially when we're catalyzing and we are bringing capital into these markets. Climate change is by far the greatest challenge that we face, and no one can be left behind because climate knows no borders. And eventually, no matter where we are in the world, we will be impacted if we take no action. It is therefore imperative that we address the financing challenges and that we do so at a phenomenal pace. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Lena. That's great. And just on the mobilization, I love the notion of an acceleration team, because this is about sweat equity as well as finance and equity, of getting into it. And I think Standard Chartered is such a unique place of having a real long-term footprint in the emerging markets. Can you bring in an example to life of how you're actually making sustainable finance work in the private sector, in the emerging markets?
So there are several ways that we are doing that. I mean, like I mentioned before, I mean, the sky is the limit in terms of what you can do from an innovation perspective. Some of the work that we're doing is, for example, around blended finance, which Peter touched on briefly. But essentially, blended finance in the sense of bringing capital from the public sector to help drive and reduce the risks that will impact certain investments or financing of projects. And therefore, that could be in different shapes or forms. It could be in the form of guarantees, in the form of subsidies, or other forms of risk mitigation. And that provides that extra catalyst, if you like, in order to bring the capital and attract the investors and financing as well into these projects. Now, what we have is a unique position in the sense that we know a lot of these investors, we know a lot of these financial institutions because we work with them on a day-to-day basis. They are our clients as well. And therefore helping them find the attractive opportunities because we also know these markets really well. Finding out those opportunities that make sense, that fit their criteria, that will evolve and bring positive change is where you see us playing a role.
Wonderful, thank you. I see some great questions coming in from the audience. Please continue. You can use the Q&A function and offer a question there, and we'll try and get to them. And I'd love to go back to you, Jules, if I could. And the other big news, of course, is the war in Ukraine. And what's your sense of this conflict on the just transition? Do we see positive elements, negative elements? How do you see this terrible event?
Yeah, let me start by echoing what you said, this horrendous war. And even if we might be able to identify some positive impacts resulting from the war, we cannot ignore the fact that this war is creating massive suffering at the hands of Mr. Putin and his cronies. But there are possibly some very small rays of hope that come from this conflict in accelerating the transition. Already back in the 70s and 80s, our institute laid out a vision of energy security that was principally based around efficient use of energy and a transition to renewable energy as the source of reliable, local, and now also cost-effective energy for everyone around the world. Over the last 2 months, the sun didn't increase in price, wind didn't suddenly become more scarce. So it just is a great way of illustrating how powerfully reliable, how energy secure those sources are. And we've always known that energy efficiency, doing more with less energy, is not only just profitable, but also makes the challenge of the transition smaller. What happened in the late 70s, early 80s, after the oil crises, the oil shocks of the 70s, is a dramatic decoupling of energy and GDP growth. So as we created a larger and larger economy, we use less energy per unit of GDP. We will undoubtedly see a similar shift again this time. But the big difference this time is that in addition, technologies like wind and solar and battery storage and electric vehicles and even hydrogen are now either already in the money or very close to being in the money. So that is a very hopeful point that as we build economies that are more energy resilient, we can at the same time accelerate the transition to a zero carbon future.
Yeah, the tools there. I recall seeing Amory Lovins, the RMI founder, 20 years ago, talking about natural capitalism and these various concepts, and it's very compelling. Yet we still haven't got over the hump in applying lots of the efficiencies that exist. So, Sana, what's your to broaden a little bit, because you talked about systemic change? How do you see the road to the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 and the just transition aligning or colliding or working together?
Thanks, Chris. That's actually a really good question. So if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals or the SDGs, there is a lot of synergies and very strong interrelationships between different SDGs. So, for example, SDG 7, which is the access to affordable and clean energy for all, and SDG 8, which is decent work and economic growth. If we just achieve those two, they would actually go quite a long way to establishing the necessary preconditions for other SDGs, such as SDG 1 and 2 to end poverty and hunger, and also the inequality SDGs, so gender equality, SDG 5 and SDG 10 on inequalities in general. Also, because the SDGs themselves cover a mixture of social, environmental and climate outcomes, you could almost say that if we just achieve all of the SDGs, we will most likely have achieved something that could quite rightfully be referred to as just transition. On the other hand, if we pour a lot of resources, a lot of investment into supporting just transition, we will most likely also make quite a lot of meaningful progress towards many of the SDGs. So to answer your question, really, yes, there are very strong relationships between the SDGs and just transition. Now, of course, we need to consider how many of the SDGs we can realistically achieve, particularly in the current context where, we have climate change very much causing loss and damage in countries. You look at East Africa, for example, various countries in East Africa being impacted year after year, whether it be drought or flooding, locust plagues. We had COVID-19, now the war in Ukraine, and all of these things are slowing down the previous gains that we already made in achieving SDGs and supporting economic growth in the least advanced countries, but also emerging economies. And they have also created new inequalities and exacerbated some of the existing inequalities. So we are kind of going backwards in some of the SDGs at the moment, unfortunately.
It is a windy road, to be kind, to our progress on some of these issues. Thank you, Sana. Peter, what's one of the most dispiriting stats I've read is that through the pandemic, I think broadly the public sector has spent $20 trillion, again with a T, and maybe 10% of that could be viewed as green or sustainable in orientation. So it feels like it was a missed opportunity in some ways. But how can we get governments and regulators to support a transition to a just transition?
Yes, no, we've been really promoting the Build Back Better as part of our COVID response and giving governments and regulators the tools with which to do that. I think the starting point is the nationally defined contributions and having that political commitment and will at the government level to implement those. And from our perspective in the private sector, some key elements in that regard. The first is that the government policies and requirements of whether that's from capital market regulator, the banking regulator, require that firms know what their climate impact is and report on it. So the whole concept of reporting and disclosure. And I think there's really was great progress at COP26 in terms of advancing that agenda. And, compliments to UNEP-FI and the whole network with GFANs that is rolled out. So that's a really important part of it. From our perspective, or from mine in the financial sector, working with the banking regulators to ensure that they're requiring their firms at least to adopt over time policies, procedures, and business plans that make them Paris-aligned. So it's a significant undertaking. At the IFC ourselves, we've been working on it for several years, just in terms of our own balance sheet. And, it's going to take us several more years. So it's a journey, it's a process, but it's critical that we start now, especially when you see reports such as the IPCC report of yesterday. So what we're doing in that regard is providing advisory service to banking regulators. We have a network of over 45 emerging market regulators through the Sustainable Banking and Finance Network. We're working with the firms themselves to help them adopt a Paris alignment. And we're leveraging a donor support to do this as well. As you know, there's NGOs, there's governments in particular. European governments have been very supportive and providing blended finance to promote deals, but also to promote advisory that will help governments and policymakers, regulators, educate themselves on what is required and then implement and execute, which is the harder part, and which takes a medium to even long-term investment. But we have to move so quickly, and so the time is not on our side.
Yeah, very good point, Peter. And I think that the engagement piece and the time invested in engaging people as the acceleration team, and Lena, you reference as well, is really fundamental. Yeah, Jules, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I heard Peter say a magic word, namely blended finance. And I want to draw attention to the importance of that in light of the report that Standard Chartered published today. The balance sheet of the World Bank Group is enormous, but even the World Bank Group on its own cannot mobilize the capital that is laid out necessary in this report, right? So it is crucial that we get the private sector to deploy massively on the energy transition in the global south. Now, here's the good news. It's a profitable investment. It's a proposition that makes total sense. It links up to all the other SDGs. We've just gone through all these arguments why this all makes sense. But here is still a barrier. And I'd love to hear Peter and Lena debate this between the two of them. We can't seem to get enough of that blended finance really put into practice. We talk a lot about it, but the number of deals that really mobilize very large amounts of private sector capital on the back of public sector finance or MDB, IDB commitments that de-risk projects rather than finance projects, that's still a huge challenge. So Peter, Lena, I'm keen to hear you guys figure out together here on stage how we're going to triple, quadruple the volume of those blended finance transactions.
Let's solve it. So, Lena, let's go to you first. And it's true. I mean, one of the exciting elements of Glasgow was Mark Carney's GFANZ, the concept of 130 trillion, again with the T, available to finance, but we need to mobilize it. So, Lena, what are your thoughts to Jules' provocation?
I think it's a great point. I think bringing in blended finance, yes, I agree that it probably hasn't taken. There's a lot more to do, but I think it's evolving, and I think it's evolving really quickly. And we are seeing it not just in financing the energy transition itself, but also the just transition, and that's basically the social angle of it, and we see it in social loans, we see it in social bonds as well. So there is an increase in the uptake for these types of structures, and the interesting thing is that we are seeing an innovative way of adapting blended finance into transactions. As I've mentioned earlier, it's not just in the form of providing guarantees, but it's also in the form where this public sector money is also playing a role. And as you've rightly said, Jules, it is a business opportunity at the same time. It's not just a challenge, but it is a business opportunity as well. And we are seeing an increased uptake on that. We are working with several institutions and stakeholders externally that are very much interested and are actually approaching us to ask how they can be part of these stories. What can they do? What kind of projects are we looking at? And this is really interesting because it's interesting to see how different players are looking at this differently, what they are looking to find out, and essentially gather around the table to find the right solutions to bring to these markets. But I don't know if Peter has anything else to add.
Yeah, what are your thoughts, Peter? And also, there's a question in the chat on. Can you describe again and define what the 900 to 1 ratio was in the leveraging? Yeah.
Sure. So maybe I'll just do that quickly first. So if we look at all of the funds available from development finance institutions and compare that to the institutional investor universe, which is 240 trillion. They have 900 times the amount of funding that we do. That's why that institutional investor universe is so important, and that's why GFANZ is so important in that whole network coming out of COP26. So yes, on blended finance, I'll just share a few thoughts from our perspective. So we've deployed over $500 million in blended finance for climate-related investments, and we're actually in the market now raising another $900 million to support our business over the next 5 years. And so we're very active in that regard. And really, you can come at it from two angles. One is reducing a risk, so allowing a deal that poses too much risk for the private sector to take place, for example, with a first loss piece. Or the piece that's more interesting to me is how do we incentivize? So we give an issuer a 1% incentive, for example, if they deploy all the funds towards green buildings or towards some new climate innovation using sustainability-linked bonds or linked loans. And the leverage factor you can get with those incentives can be very significant. So 1% can allow a deal to happen that otherwise wouldn't. So your leverage factor can be even 100 to 1. So that's going to be key. And I think, an interesting example of that, although we haven't got to the details of how the transition will be structured, but we'll be looking at South Africa in this 8.5 billion commitment coming out of COP26 to help them transition away from coal energy production. So in effect, that's a pool of donor funds, government funds that can be used to really accelerate this movement away. So I think that's critically important. Another thought I would share is that blended finance can help on investment, but it can also help on technical assistance and advisory. And in fact, when we look at our own business and we see what is the greenhouse gas emission reduction, either from investments or advisory, interestingly, advisory, it's more significant. So over 80% of our GHG reductions actually come from the advisory side of the business. And the reason for that is if you use advisory to create a new green bond framework, and then 20, 50, 100 issuers come thereafter to issue green bonds, then you've just done an amazing thing with that maybe 5 million in advisory. So we're really doing that comprehensively across the larger markets to allow for that transition to happen more quickly and finance it well beyond what development finance institutions could bring.
Terrific. That's fantastic. And Sana, there's a question around the transition off of fossil fuels in developing countries and maybe some of the political instability that is connected to. And I think the example of helping fund the transition of South Africa, which is so reliant on coal in particular as an energy source and very high levels of unemployment, so lots of fragility, I think, in the economy in many ways. And what are your thoughts on that? And I think, does it connect to the fact that the next COP27, will be in Egypt, which maybe will have a different feel or texture compared to Glasgow, given it's in the developing world? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the level of disruption that we will experience will largely be influenced by how we manage the transition process. Obviously, the longer we continue to do very little, the more disruptive the transition is going to have to be when we eventually are forced to do it, because climate change simply reaches a point where a lot of the regions in the world become uninhabitable. There will be climate refugees, and we will be feeling the climate change impacts very much across the world. And if we get to that point and we need to start acting extremely fast, let's say 2030, 2040, it will be highly disruptive, and there will be no way to mitigate the level of disruption it's going to cause. The sooner we act, the better we can pace out the process, and the better we can mitigate the level of disruption. In terms of next COP being in Africa, so this will be the first time that there will be a COP in Africa since 2011, when it took place in South Africa, and a lot has changed since then. Several of the other panelists have already mentioned some very significant developments coming out of the COP26 in Glasgow. Just transition was a major issue that was discussed, particularly in reference to advanced economies at the COP25 in Katowice. In Glasgow, we saw many of these commitments coming, as you also mentioned, Mark Carney, driving action of private sector investors. The very significant financial sector commitments made in Glasgow. So I would kind of like to see this trend continuing, but I would also like to see actual delivery of these commitments and of these promises. If we look back to the Paris Agreement, advanced economies promised to spend 100 billion a year to support climate action in less advanced economies. That target has never been met. It's not clear whether it ever will be met. At the same time, we see a lot more commitment, a lot more interest, a lot more appetite for socially, environmentally sustainable investment from the private sector. So, it really is going to be fascinating to see whether this discourse continues and whether it results in action when we have a COP in Africa, where I think the focus will be a lot on adaptation and adaptation finance, as well as climate change mitigation finance.
And we seem to be terrible at doing that compensation, the just equal compensation that we promise in these global negotiations. But we also, given the public sector spending through the pandemic, the private sector is really increasingly indispensable in the transition. And Jules, you talked about the importance of, or the opportunity for business to invest and to be highly compensated or profit from these investments. Can we talk a little more tactically of how do we incentivize this? Is there some tricks of the trade? Do we need to just magnify case studies more clearly? What are the obstacles or blocks in making this more money flow to these investment opportunities?
Well, it goes to some of the things that Sana just said and Peter said a moment ago before. The speed of the energy transition, the upheavals that are happening in the energy system are so fast and so significant that it is very hard for business executives around the world to keep up, for bankers to be fully up to speed, but also for policymakers and politicians all around the world, but certainly also in the global south, to be completely up to speed on the pace of the change, and particularly the pace of the change in the economics. So much of the technologies we're talking about are now more profitable, more economically attractive, even in the global south. In fact, Peter, you referred to the deal in South Africa, which is such a critical one, but it is already very obvious that new wind and solar is more economic in South Africa than accelerating further deployment of coal or building out more coal. It even gets to the point where we can now see how you can shut down old coal plants in South Africa, replace them with wind and solar, and still have money to spare. So these changes are happening very rapidly. The technical assistance that Peter then referred to becomes critically important, because how do you help Eskom, South African government, to structure the deals and to create the policy and regulatory environment in the electricity market that incents private investments to be deployed at scale? Right now, with the role that Eskom plays and with the political arena within which that discussion plays out, that's not so obvious. But if we can find our way towards a competitive electricity market where private capital can be deployed, I'm very confident that we'll see a massive increase in that 8 billion that was committed by governments to finance whatever is necessary in South Africa. And we will need to do that all around the global south. So the technical assistance is critical. The policy and regulatory frameworks are critically important. For that, we also need to bring technical assistance to bear. And we need to do that hand in glove with the private sector so that they can indeed invest in projects that by themselves are very profitable.
That's a great optimistic way to end your comments, Jules. Let's go around quickly. Others on the table. Lena, what are you most excited or optimistic about going forward?
I'm really optimistic about the fact that we are seeing things come to action. I'm really optimistic about the fact that we are coming up with solutions, that we are working together, whether it's banks, investors, stakeholders in the government or in the public sector, the multilaterals and others as well, who are coming together around the table. And you see all of these alliances that are happening at a bigger level and a global level, but also there are these alliances that are happening at a more country level or regional level, where economies are coming together and realizing that this is not just my problem or your problem, it is our problem to solve, because we all have something to lose here if we don't do something about it. I'm optimistic, like I said, about the creativity that's coming to the market. In terms of financing solutions and advisory solutions, in terms of the technologies as well that are coming into play. And these are technologies, like if you look at hydrogen, for example, it was just something that we talked about years ago, right? Now we're seeing, this being implemented practically, realistically. We can see it, it's happening. And therefore, we need it to happen faster, but I'm very optimistic about all of these evolvements and changes.
Great. And Peter, what's your happy thoughts?
Emerging markets. So emerging markets are actually, percentage-wise, the largest emitters. And so they need to be a core part of the transition. And I think the fact that we are so focused on the just transition, and that will have even more relevance in emerging markets, I think that's such a critical starting point. And taking the momentum from COP26 and the alliances that have been created, and that recognition that the global financial system needs to finance a transition, particularly in emerging markets, that gives me hope. And that shows, for me, the role that we need to play as a DFI World Bank is to bring some of those funds to finance this transition. So that's my optimistic thought to close.
Terrific. And Sana, you're the last word to you on what you're excited about.
Well, it's two things really. One of the things that I'm very excited about is how this idea of just transition and just transition being imperative to mitigating the impact of climate change and mitigating climate change becoming more mainstream, and really moving away from let's make sure that coal workers will be looked after so that they will also support this transition, to really looking at just transition at societal and global scale. And then there is the growing momentum amongst private sector, so businesses, investors, financing institutions, really looking at investing in just transition, investing in green energy, both in advanced economies and emerging economies, and really beginning to see this as an opportunity, not an obligation. And the growing momentum around that shift, it's really encouraging.
Yeah, and I think all of your comments, it's there. We do a lot of work in behavior change, more of at a micro level, and I think the way we get people to change at scale and pace, which is the hard part, are seem to be two things. One is there's an irresistibility that's really required. So an electric vehicle is more beautiful and high performing than a typical traditional car, for example. I think the same is true in how you're articulating, I think Jules in particular, the benefit of renewable energy. I mean, it's a better product, right? It's a more irresistible product. It's ongoing. There's longevity to it. The externalities are lower. All the rest of it. But in addition to irresistibility, we need inevitability. And that inevitability requires the sort of systemic signals and all of that sweat equity that Lena and Peter, you were talking about, of working with regulators, engaging investors, bringing it. So all of those inevitable signals of this is the future. We might as well get into it now because it's coming, it's happening. And I think those two things have to be in play for us to get the shift. And hopefully we're at a hockey stick angle. But I thank you all for listening in. I thank Standard Chartered for convening these important conversations. This is really important that we dialogue and move more quickly at pace again. And thank you, Jules. Thank you, Sana. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Lena, so much. And everyone stay safe and take good care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.